Kevin Flaherty, a podcast hoster for Kansas City Sports Network, has covered the Big 12 in basketball for a long, long time, the state of Kansas recruiting, and also we'll get into Big 12 football, too, with KU and Kansas State. Kevin, thank you very much. So we had you on a couple of different times, and things were changing for you. Now that you're a part of this, and congratulations, and your thoughts about how things have been at the Kansas City Sports Network.
Yeah, things have been great. Not only have they kind of tapped me to help them with their Kansas beat stuff, but also I've always had a passion for recruiting and kind of had a passion for state of Kansas recruiting, because a lot of those guys can tend to get overlooked and they wind up leaving the state a lot of times and being really, really good players. And so the fact that they offered me a show and a chance to talk about those guys was really something nice and kind of a passion project to go along with that as well.
So, Kevin, let's before we get into recruiting, let's get down to brass tacks, because you have the Pay Heat podcast as well. Sure. Is Kansas going to figure out their lineup?
That's the $1 million question, right? I think, Bill Self, after they lost to Kansas State over the weekend, he brought up the defense is the biggest thing. And I think lack of focus is probably the single biggest issue that they have. But when you look at, they've really struggled to find sort of that perfect lineup, haven't found it yet. And it sounds weird to say about a team that ranks number 5, I think, in the country defensively, according to KenPom, but their defensive spurts have really been hit or miss. And so there have been times when they've looked like an octopus and they've strangled people out, and the defense has been fantastic. You look at the start of the game against Duke, the game that they wound up winning on a neutral court, the defense was terrific early on it and kind of propelled that whole thing. You look at the game against Kansas State, and Kansas State, as we know, is a team that's been pretty inconsistent offensively, and maybe that's even a kind way to put it. And Kansas just couldn't get stops at all. And after the game, Self said, hey, we couldn't even defend our own shadow. And so I think one of the challenges there is a challenge that a lot of people are dealing with, in that the best offensive players are not also the best defensive players. And so how do you mix and match those guys to where you're not taking too much off the table defensively while also being a team that's able to score the ball?
Is what Jerome Tang and Kansas State have done remarkable, considering where they were? It looked like there were games that KU, one of them, and a couple of others where they just kind of shot themselves in the foot, could not sustain any momentum. But they now have won 5 straight since Scott Drew visited with the team in the post-game locker room.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch, because I think when you looked at this team early on, and I know you guys know Jerome Tang, I do as well, just watching the press conferences, watching the way he interacted with his team, I kind of felt like, man, he may not even like these guys, right? It seemed like it was kind of an awkward fit. And I talked to a pretty good source that I have, and he said, no, Jerome Tang really likes these guys. He's just kind of waiting for it to click, and it hadn't clicked yet, and they needed to work through some things. You're seeing Doug McDaniel all of a sudden starting to play well. Coleman Hawkins, I think a lot of people forget, was a complimentary guy at Illinois who did a lot of things really well, but wasn't necessarily the starring player. And so it was a little bit of a new role for him. He had to kind of figure out that, hey, I can't score 6 or 8 points and not contribute in these other ways, because this is a team that needs more from me. You add in the growth of certain guys along with that group, and David Gesson's been terrific as sort of a glue guy for them as well. And I'll tell you what, this is a Kansas State team right now. I know it sounds weird to say about a team that is basically right around 500, but they're playing well enough that they could make a run at the NCAA tournament if they don't trip up here down the stretch.
Do you think that there is anyone who can catch Houston reasonably? Maybe Iowa State, if they get healthy?
Iowa State is the team that I would say, if you had the Big 12 tournament 2 weeks from now who could beat Houston in the Big 12 tournament, I would pick Iowa State. I think Arizona, as great as they've been, I think some of the things there have been schedule related. The Big 12 schedule is so unbalanced, and so you have an area where you're going through just absolute murderer's row, and it feels like you can't win. And then all of a sudden, you'll play 4 of the teams in the Big 12 that are ranked near the bottom aren't anywhere near being NCAA tournament teams. And so teams look hot and then they get cold, and vice versa. You asked me about Kansas earlier. Kansas went through a really tough stretch, and now all of a sudden you've got Colorado, I think, twice. You've got BYU. You've got Arizona State. So the schedule does ease up for them significantly. I think with Arizona, some of it's been schedule related. I think Arizona's just an inconsistent team, which sounds weird to say about a team that's 11-1 in conference. The defensive stretches for Arizona, when they are locked in, are terrific. And I think when you look at some of their lineups, that's sort of how they can get their hay in the barn. The shot making can be a little bit inconsistent, and I think that's where I would hesitate to say, hey, this team can catch Houston overall in the Big 12 standings, even though they're right there with them. Houston is just so good on a night in, night out basis. And I feel like Arizona is going to struggle down the stretch to sort of keep pace with them. But if you're saying, hey, who's the Big 12 team that could potentially win a Big 12 tournament, could potentially go the furthest in the NCAA tournament outside of Houston, I would say Iowa State with Milan Momcilovic back. I really think that's a good group. I think Curtis Jones looked so much more comfortable in their win coming off the bench as a sixth man. I think he had 24 points. So, yeah, you look at that Iowa State team as a team that's very dangerous right now.
Well, you have Houston ranked in the top 10. Iowa State, of course, is there as well, and others are trying to get to that position. Last year's national tournament did not go very well, Kevin, for the Big 12. They were touted as the best conference. You can get the analytics, the data, and all that. And, of course, Kansas and Baylor winning national titles, Tech playing right there for one in recent years. How bad – not bad, but how important is it for this conference to get their mojo back in the postseason?
Yeah, I think it's really important because I think the non-conference didn't go as well as maybe a lot of people would have thought. And it did for the SEC, right? When you look at the way sort of that narrative shifted, it shifted before conference play even started. There wasn't a chance for people to tune into a random Big 12 game on January 15th and say, oh my gosh, this is the best basketball in the country, because at that point the SEC had already lapped the Big 12 this year. And I think for all the additions to the Big 12, when you add so many teams, you're going to dilute the product to some extent. And some of the additions have been terrific, obviously, when you look at how good Arizona's been. Houston, obviously, being a recent addition. But also, you don't have 10 teams anymore where you're hoping to get 8 of those 10 into the NCAA tournament. Now it's looking like the Big 12 could get 8 teams in the NCAA tournament, but it's only half the league. And you're looking at part of the league not even really being in contention. I think, and this is off the top of my head, so I'm really hoping that I'm not wrong on this, but if I remember right, in 2018, when Kansas went to the Final Four, the Devontae Graham team, they won the conference that year. I believe Oklahoma State maybe finished last in the Big 12 that year, and I think they might have swept Kansas. And so it was literally an any given Saturday type situation where the worst teams in the league were capable of playing up and beating the best teams in the league. And I just don't know that that's the case. I do think the Big 12, even though there isn't necessarily a team that you look at it today as it is and say this team is a 1 seed, I do think the Big 12 is still pretty strong at the top. I think the middle is solid. I think where you get into the difference is you're not ending at 10 teams. There's an 11th, a 12th, a 13th, and on down. And so I think that's where you start to see the separation is the Big 12 isn't nearly as strong top to bottom just because there are more teams.
Well, the SEC, that's crazy how top-heavy they are.
Yeah.
It is. In Alabama, Auburn plays Saturday. Alabama's in Austin tonight against a Jekyll, whatever you want to feel like, Texas team at times. And and then of course the SEC with us. Okay, now you've covered recruiting for quite some time too, and I know it's mainly about the state of Texas. So, in your opinion, how did Kansas pivot from not having the year everyone expected with what they've added to the mix in recruiting, portal, whatever, and then K-State with Chris Kleiman and what the Wildcats have done?
Yeah, it was a weird year for Kansas, right? And it was funny. I was listening to you guys talk just before I came on, where you said you were going to break down the schedules of all the different Big 12 teams and say, hey, this team is going to have it easy. This team maybe doesn't play the road games that are as tough. If there's one thing that I learned from this year, and I actually wrote the Big 12 preview for Lindy's, so please don't bring those predictions up. But when you look at those predictions, a big part of the reason that I thought that Kansas would have a big year, don't get me wrong, the experience was coming back. You had a getting healthy Jalen Daniels, you had Devin Neal, you had a lot of reasons for optimism, but I thought that schedule was going to be so manageable, right? When you looked at it, you're like, oh, you avoid Oklahoma State, you avoid Utah, you avoid Arizona. They avoid a lot of these top teams, and you're playing Arizona State, who, is down, 15th or 16th. You're playing Houston, and Houston wound up being, what I expected for a Willie Fritz team. Exceptionally well coached. Willie Fritz is terrific. You knew they were going to jump up and bite somebody, but they weren't consistent. But other than that, BYU, Arizona State being two of the best teams in the Big 12, like who would have predicted that before the season? And who would have predicted, hey, by the way, Kansas, your schedule looks easy, but you're playing both BYU and Arizona State on the road, and I think that's one of the tough things about projecting this is I thought Arizona State heading into last year was a year away. And obviously they wound up making that leap, but that also speaks to, I think, how good Arizona State has a chance to be this way. And that's a really long way to say Kansas's schedule wound up being a lot tougher than I think we thought it would be heading in. Colorado wound up being a lot better, and that's a team that they actually beat. Arizona State, Kansas has a lead against Arizona State in Tempe in the final minute and loses. And they just kept finding sort of these Lucy pulling the ball away from Charlie Brown ways to lose games at the very end. This was a team that with a couple bounces differently could have been a 10-win team, but they didn't win those games. And at the same time, I thought it was really interesting. We had Devin Neal on the Verbal Commitment podcast, which is the Kansas recruiting podcast that we do. And he said his favorite memory at Kansas was beating the 3 ranked teams in a row this year, even with all the issues they had. And so as weird as it sounds, Kansas came out of a 5-7 season when people thought they were a Big 12 dark horse team as maybe a little bit better than you would have expected because they had the strong close, excepting, of course, the game down in Waco in the season finale. But I think it was actually the sort of thing that people circled, and they were able to go into living rooms and talk about the program's culture, just sort of hey, there was a lot of bad voodoo this season. All this stuff was going against you. You start off 2-6, and you wind up just missing a bowl game. That speaks to the culture. And so they kind of, rolled in the mud and came out smelling like roses, as weird as it sounds. K-State, I think, is in a fascinating position right now because Kansas State also had some close games, but found ways to win those close games. Now you have Avery Johnson heading into his second year as a starter. He's a guy I really like personally, as well as, as a football player. And what I mean by that is not, hey, I'm going over to his house for dinner. I mean, I think he's really strong intangibly and a great leader. And so I'm interested to see the leap there that he makes. He's got a lot of weapons around him. And so when you took that into the recruiting aspect of it, Kansas State has always dominated the state of Kansas pretty much since Mark Mangino left. Kansas had a little bit of a stretch there when Mangino was hot, where they were winning those in-state battles. But other than that, it really hasn't happened that much. Devin Neal was maybe the one, example that you could look at the other way. And Devin Neal had KU posters on his wall when he was 10 years old. So he was always going to go to KU. But all of a sudden, you look into this 2026 class, and Kansas has landed, I think, 5 of the top 10 players in the state. Looks like they're going to add a couple more in there. Kansas State is kind of struggling to generate momentum with those guys. But as we all know, nothing's done until the ink is dry. And in the portal era, nothing is done until the ink is dry and you've been locked into a significant NIL deal for multiple years at your school. But right now, it does look like Kansas is generating some really significant recruiting momentum in state. I still think that Kansas State's going to find players just because that staff is such a tremendous evaluating staff, and they do just such a great job of it.
Kevin, great stuff, man. Great to have you on. I'm glad where you landed. It seems like you're having a great time. Also, the Kansas City Sports Network. We have others that work there that we have on the show occasionally. So thanks for your time. Have a great week.
Thank you very much.
Kevin Flaherty, again, the Kansas City Sports Network, college athletics, college basketball. He's really good at that. I sat next to him during that great Baylor comeback against North Carolina up in Fort Worth.